Hey everybody, welcome to this week's Q&As. Let's jump right in and see what we got this week. First up on Floatplane, JD213 said, "Glad I knew that the numbers after their initials read 213, guessing since I'm a fellow metalhead." Actually, no, I just am so used to reading people's screen names and trying not to get them wrong over the years, but I am a massive metalhead. Continuing, they watched Slayer's live intrusion on VHS countless times since they were a teenager and still have it too. Wish they would release the full concert. Yeah, I think a friend of mine had that one. I got for the holidays one year the Metallica box set with the VHS tapes, which that day I just ran up and watched all three tapes run one right after the other. It was absolutely awesome. And the ones that I never got but really wanted were the Megadeth ones. And eventually when I was, late teens, early 20s, I was able to pick them up and did whatever terrible VHS to DVD transfer I used to do, which for the time was actually fine based on the equipment I had. But one of the things I just got, a sealed copy of Megadeth's Rusted Pieces. Now, this isn't special. You could find this on YouTube, I'm sure. There's a million copies, but this is brand new and sealed. So what I wanted to do eventually, once I started working on more of the Doomsday stuff, is I'm going to start with Laserdiscs just because it's going to be a bit easier. And when I move on to VHS, I want to get this, and I want to see if I can get a bunch of other people with mint copies to all put them together so that we end up getting one really awesome 480i rip of this thing. Why? Because we can. That's it. There's no other reason to. That's nothing on here that you can't find elsewhere. But then who knows? Maybe we'll do the same with the Slayer stuff. But anyway, on to JD's actual question. They recently found out about the low-pass filter mod for the Genesis 1 VA3 to VA6, where certain capacitors are replaced to make the filtering closer to the original Genesis 1 VA0 to VA2 boards. But there doesn't seem to be too much info online that they could find. They assume a similar mod is built into the triple bypass, but they were just wondering if I had any knowledge or experience about this. So it's been 5 years since I dug deep into it, so I'm sure my concepts are right, but my info might not be. But yes, definitely the triple bypass has that audio circuit so that you get something closer to the original Genesis 1. You can absolutely just do the audio mod to the other VA3 to VA6s for that instead. But I don't know where that info would be. It could be on Firebrand X's website. It could be on the Console Mods wiki. And if it's not on the wiki, it would be very awesome if somebody would be kind enough to add stuff there. But that's a really good question, and I forgot everything about that, which is weird because I spent really an unhealthy amount of time trying to make Genesis 1s as perfect as possible. And, we came real close, and we did a lot of amazing research, and I dropped a stupid amount of money buying all those different revisions and doing multiple tests, and I just don't remember where any of the actual data was. Because from my perspective, a lot of these tests ended up being complete failures. So I didn't write them as guides. I just kept them as notes. And then I don't remember what we did with all of the successes. I don't know if we took pictures. I don't know if they were floating around on people's social media. I don't know if I just got so busy that they're lost through that. But if anybody listening works with Console Mods Wiki and would be willing to put stuff like that up, please let us know. And if I'm just getting all this stuff wrong, let me know as well. But I know the triple bypass info is correct. But heck, maybe there's already a guide up somewhere. So sorry, JD. Thanks for the VHS memories. And sorry I didn't get a real answer for you. Next up, Shorjor wanted to continue the conversation from last week about using that awesome Luva CRT with a VGA input module. And they said, Luda mentioned that the VGA input card for Luva CRTs only works with 31 kilohertz, and they tested it themselves, and that seems to be correct. And that matches my experience with my two Luva TVs that I had, that the VGA input would only accept 480p or 1080i, not 720p, not 480i, not 240p. So that matches up and that makes sense. So currently they have everything hooked up through the OSSC so that when their PS2 boots, it boots in line double mode, and then you could switch it over to 480p games if you want to. But that way the OSSC is always feeding it 480p. So that seems to be working for them, but one thing that would be neat is if the OSSC could support auto switching based on inputs having signal coming in. And I believe it does. Make sure you're on the latest firmware, and if you don't have the mod done, just the latest firmware from last year would have this feature. But I'll leave a link to the wiki where it says auto detect input, and I believe you could change it between auto detect on signal per input or just auto detect the whole thing. So for example, if you have SCART that carries component video and RGB, like you're running everything through a switch, it could just auto detect only the SCART input based on what the signal is, or you could just have it detect whatever input's coming in. So that should work. SureSure's also been looking into the GBS control, which might be a better fit for what they have for the setup. So the only thing I'll add to that is if the games that you play on PlayStation 2 are predominantly 480i, the GBSC would be better for its motion adaptive deinterlacing, but it is still a do-it-yourself solution, which is never an insult when I say that. I just want to set realistic expectations in that you have to have your phone out, you have to be using your app connected to your Wi-Fi in order to change things. There isn't just a remote or some buttons on it you could use. And another alternative that you might want to just consider is leave the OSSC. However, for 480i only games, consider composite video for that, which is weird to say, but a lot of those early 3D graphics games, even into the PlayStation 2 era, when you're running in 480i on a CRT, not on a flat panel, using composite video really blends the graphics together in some cases to make it look very, very cool. Not all cases, and in many scenarios, you would still want your best of the best signal coming out of that, but I just wanted to float that idea because I personally have a bunch of consoles set up that way for that exact reason. Also, they're wondering about downscaling to 480p so that they could run modern consoles on this amazing Luva CRT. And I would absolutely suggest checking out Marco's downscaling section of RetroRGB because he has all of the reviews up there for everything you might need. The one thing that's going to be different for you is you only need to go to 480p. You don't need to go lower than that to 480i or 240p. So the devices that you could use, it'll open up a lot more devices. You could get one of those Extron VSC 300s or something. That's the one I tested on there. But there's a description of everything there. That might be something that would be easier for you. And I strongly recommend trying because not every modern game is going to look good on a CRT. And in fact, I would argue that many probably look best on an OLED because, a modern HD resolution with square pixels is what they were designed on and tested on. But a lot look really, really cool on a CRT with those perfect black levels and, virtually no motion blur on there. So I think it's worth your time to give it a try. Just look into whatever is going to be the best for you that could take an input signal and go down to 480p. And also look into EDID spoofers and stuff, because maybe you could take the HDMI output of a modern console and try to force a 480p resolution. And that's not going to work on all consoles, but it certainly would on many, including the Switch. So give it a try. But yeah, I think you have a clear path as to where you want to go in this. You still have to make a few decisions, but it sounds like an awesome gaming experience. Next up, Dumez uses an HD Retrovision Genesis 2 cable along with some adapters to have it work on PS1, Saturn, TurboGrafx 16, and then of course Genesis Model 2. And Dumez was wondering, how does the HD Retrovision cable handle the processing and the colors from all of those different consoles if it's meant to be used with the Genesis 2? Could there be differences or issues, or is the setup now basically perfect? And for the most part, I would say that setup is absolutely perfect, and it's going to be as good as can be reasonably expected to be. Now, when it comes to deep dive analysis, so if you're building the next crazy mod for something, you might want to go direct RGB into something like an OSSC or direct RGB input so you could control every aspect of the analysis. But that's not for daily use. That's for if you're building a mod and you want to make sure you're not changing anything, or if you're doing any kind of comparisons. If you're talking for just gaming, then the HD Retrovisions do an equal job at multiple consoles as long as it's compatible as the RGB to comp from the RetroTINK device. And I think the RGB to comp is compatible with a lot more stuff, but when you compare it to what the HD Retrovisions do with the PS1 and Saturn, they're very comparable. So basically, don't worry about it. If you suddenly one day want to do deep dive analysis of video signals, reference retrorgb.com and all of the insane hoops you're going to have to jump through to get that. But other than that, no, what you have is near perfect to the point where I would never personally worry about anything. And I think you should just be happy that you have great shielded cables that are going to work the way they're supposed to. Now moving over to Patreon, Josh Lopez just got a good deal on a secondhand Ryzen Mini PC, and they're considering using it to emulate old PC games, flash software, etc. They were wondering, in my opinion, what would be the easiest way to hook it up to an old VGA CRT monitor. I think that scenario is going to be pretty easy as long as you're talking about 480p or maybe slightly higher, 800 by 600, those lower resolutions, maybe up to 1280 by 1024. And if that's the case, just use an HDMI to VGA converter. And since it's a PC and you could potentially have separate audio outputs anyway, you could get one of those super cheap, less than $10 little dongle devices that do that. And everything's going to be perfect. I mean, the black levels are going to be great. Everything's going to be exactly what you're expecting in that scenario for very, very cheap. And then just run your audio to PC monitor or PC speakers or something like that. So I would do that. You would just need to find a way to force the resolution to those lower ones. And there's different utilities you could use. You mentioned Ryzen, so I'm assuming that's going to have an AMD built-in graphics chip. So you could use Switch Res and a couple other things. I would really just do a very basic Google search or something for what people are using these days on that. But there's a bunch of different programs that allow you to force resolutions out of your PC. And I would start by having the default resolution be the highest that your monitor could handle within reason, right? So, 1280 by 1024, 800 by 600, one of those. That way there's still enough resolution for you to be able to use it normally. And then you could switch down to the lower resolutions for the games that would require it. And then you could also kind of getting into switching resolutions per game, and it starts to get a little complicated, but just doing it manually at first is a really easy way to do it. One trick that I used when I was testing this, way back when I still lived in the apartment in Stanford, was that I'd have all of the stuff that was 240p or 480p, I would have icons on the desktop. So that way when I switched it into the 480p mode, then, the whole screen would be filled up with those icons, but they'd be right there. So I could just click on them. And I thought that was a lot easier than trying to drop the resolution down and then go to the start menu and launch everything that way. But there's a bunch of different ways to do it. You could have different launchers and program it to change resolutions and stuff. But I just wanted to share that little tip just in case it helped. Next up, Tony Shadwick is asking about NES Lumacode and RGB mods, as well as a replacement RF board. And this is a lot to unpack, and it's something that I'm hoping to either do a video on or help somebody else with a video on in the near future. So I can give you a basic overview now, but my answers aren't going to be solid until I finish my research. Maybe what you need already exists, but I just don't know about it yet. So let me just kind of move forward. Right now, the Lumacode boards are available. They're, I think, about to sell out, but I'm going to see if I could help out trying to get more of those in stock. And Lumacode is a way to solder a board to the bottom of the NES motherboard. You do not need to replace the PPU for this, which means no desoldering, which is a very big deal. And then you only run one RCA jack, which means you could do it no cut. You could run it out of any of the vent holes or instead of the RF module, and that would get you a signal that then needs to be decoded. You could use some stuff that's already being sold, or you could use like an open source scan converter, and you could choose to either go to HDMI or to RGB or component if you use HDMI converters like that. So I think that's going to be the go-to mod for most people. You still would want a standard RGB mod if you know for a fact you also want S-Video, because I don't think there's an easy way to do that without a bunch of extra converters, which if you already own, cool. But that's the biggest feature. And also if you like any of the multiple color palettes and all the stuff that Tim's board currently has, that would certainly be another option. But I do think the potential for Lumacode is really there, and you retain the composite video output as well. Now, the RF replacement board is something I've always really wanted a solid solution, and there were a bunch of different people that made very good solutions, but I think each one had some kind of shortcoming. So what I'm personally looking for now is an RF replacement board that's got a solid power circuit on there. Somebody like Zaxor that truly understands power circuits, it might be able to put something together, or even piggyback off of Bordy's existing work, just kind of seeing what he did, tweaking if necessary, probably not. But then the other thing that I was hoping for is having just a built-in spot to solder 2 points for the Lumacode, so you could use the RF output as Lumacode. I would also hope that there's some kind of sticker, or maybe the RF jack in back is now a completely different color, so people know it's not, it's not the same. But that way you could have a truly no-cut NES that retains all functionality except RF, and also adds the Lumacode support. So I don't know if that exists. I think there's got to be at least one out there, and if not, it probably is in the works or could be done fairly easy, but I haven't determined that yet. So that's certainly something I would really be interested in looking into, because that might even be an easy thing too for people whose capacitors have leaked out on their RF board and they just need a replacement. So also, what another commenter mentioned was that, CZO24E said you could get the versions that have the Genesis 9-pin edition, which does get you composite out of there, and that would work. Composite in RGB, and you could mount it in the RF jack. That would absolutely work as well, and there were ones out there that worked okay. But yeah, that's certainly something to think about. Now, whether you want Lumacode and RGB, and RGB at the same time, I think you could do that, and then you could get dual HDMI and RGB right from the same console. But I think the only reason you would need that is if you were a streamer that very specifically wanted to just go directly into a capture card while you're gaming on a CRT. But it's up to you. You could just be a crazy nerd like me and want every option available to you. There's nothing wrong with that at all. The other question that was kind of buried in here in the response is that, do other cheaper scalers have support for Lumacode, and specifically the GBS Control or the RetroTink 2X Pro? So it's impossible to add to the 2X Pro. That is feature complete. There is nothing else that could be done to that. And there's no FPGA in there, so it's not like you could repurpose it. That 2X Pro is just, it is what it is forever, which I think is fine. I think it's still exactly what people pay for. I believe it's possible on the GBS Control, but Rama would have to add that, and I don't know how complicated that is. Hopefully that's something that I could talk to the developers about and see. But that's certainly a possibility. At the moment, it's just OSSC, but maybe the TINK 5X and 4Ks would get that option at some point in the future, which I think would be pretty cool. But for now, yeah, you either get the boards right from the same store that you would get the Lumacode mods, or you just use an OSSC. So I'll follow up on all of this and hopefully have some kind of video out relatively soon. But I just think having a completely no-cut mod with a Lumacode port instead of the RF jack and, replacement as much as you can, I think would be a pretty big deal. So yeah, I'll be following up on that soon. Next up, Lloyd Smart wants to know if there's currently any solution for loading Wii games from RetroNAS or any other kind of server. No, and it's something that I really, really want, and I think it's just something that the devs who work on those Wii tools need to understand that people would actually use them. Because in their defense, I'm sure they get a million requests from people that just want changes for their personal setup. They're going to go, no, I'm not spending hundreds of hours writing that just for one person. But I think if they realized how many people are starting to adopt RetroNAS or RetroNAS-like solutions, they might actually look into it, because that's so much easier than transferring games back and forth. But that's going to have to be up to them. Also, do I have any tips for fixing small chips or scratches on CRT glass? I have to be very honest with you. I am way too chicken shit to do that. I have seen a bunch of solutions that looked great, but every single time I thought, what could possibly go wrong? And then I thought, I'd rather just ignore the chip or scratch that's there. So I think it was Gadget UK had a video on that. There was a bunch of people that are good devs. There aren't just like fly-by-night YouTubers, making up stuff as they go. They've shown some guides where it really looked like it made a big difference, but I haven't tried any because I just am afraid I'm going to do more damage than good. And it's definitely my luck that 10 people could do the same thing and 9 out of 10 get it perfect, and I do the same thing and mine looks crappy. So yeah, I don't know. Sorry, I'm kind of useless for you for these answers, but anybody in the comments, chime in if you've done CRT glass repair like that, and let me know what your experience was. Next up, John Woods is looking to connect their Mister to both a Sony PVM as well as an OLED TV, and they were looking at a ton of the different options available and the different DACs and the different converters, and I really strongly think that the basic output is going to be by far the best option for this. And here's what I mean by that. You take the HDMI output of the DE10 and you run that to your OLED, and then you use one of the I/O boards to go along with it for analog video output. If you haven't bought one yet, or if you really are just looking for the the best, get one of the newer 24-bit compatible ones so your PlayStation 1 and N64 cores could look their best. It's not going to make a difference on almost every other core, but if you don't own one yet, it's kind of a no-brainer. And if you have one of the much older ones, it's probably a good idea to upgrade if you have something like a PVM, where you could probably see the differences in quality and the even colors and brightness on there. And I think that's the only way to go in almost all scenarios. Now, you mentioned a couple of other setups where you could use different kind of DACs and converters, but you're not going to gain anything from that other than a lot of extra wires. The only thing that you might gain something from, and I would only recommend this if you have other consoles that you're looking to scale, but you could use something like the RetroTink 4K Pro or CE to go from HDMI to your OLED. Now, if you said you were on a budget and you were using an LCD TV, I would never suggest that. But the fact that you've spent the money on an OLED means that you should just think about this. Now, if you tell me that your only retro is done on the Mister and the next oldest console you have is a PS4, don't spend the money. Just enjoy the awesome output of the Mister. You'll be totally fine, unless you have lots of extra money to spend, and then by all means. However, if you tell me that you also have a PlayStation 2, which requires really good deinterlacing, and even Dreamcast or other stuff out there, yeah, maybe you could also get one of those scalers, set Mister's HDMI output to direct video, and have a really, really good experience on the OLED with all that CRT mask emulation and stuff like that. But once again, that's if you have a huge budget or if you would use it for multiple things. I would not tell you to get the TINK 4K Pro just in that one scenario for your Mister. It's just a lot of money for something like that, but something to consider. But even if you do want the best, start with it exactly as you have it, because depending on what you need it for, you might be totally fine just as is. But yeah, the short answer to your question is I would recommend, if you're looking for quality, just getting one of the 24-bit I/O boards. I reviewed the Mr. Add-ons one. I really did a deep dive. So did Kuro, and it's awesome. There's nothing at all wrong with it whatsoever. So that's a very good one to get. I believe Retro Castle is launching one as well, or already did. I can't remember, to be honest with you, but I haven't been having a harder time keeping up with Ivory lately, so I got to reach out and say hello again. But yeah, the Mr. Add-ons one I think might be in stock too, so that would be my recommendation at the moment. Next up, the Remora missed out on the scalable video switch, but knows they're coming back in stock around April and wants to plan their setup and just wants to make sure they're buying the right modules when the time is right. Most of their consoles output either HDMI or YPBPR video, and the two that don't are the 3DO and PC Engine, which are outputting S-Video for those. So the question they have with it is their output side. Obviously, they just buy all the corresponding correct input modules, but in the output side, they need to go to the TINK 4K and the RetroTink 5X. The TINK 4K goes to their TV, and the 5X goes to their capture setup. So what modules would they need for that? I actually have some thoughts on using two of those scalers. We'll get back to that in a second. But to answer your question directly, you would need 3 output modules. One VGA, which would go directly to the TINK 4K, and that's going to handle all of those signals. And that's going to handle the auto switching and everything else that you need. And it should also handle the auto switching on the input side as well. So that should be fine for the 5X for its inputs. But for the 5X, you would need a YPBPR component video output and an S-Video output. You would need 2 of those modules, and you'd want to run them both. I don't know how audio would work on that one. If audio is run through both of them at the same time, you would probably just need some HD Retrovision cables from the component video out to the TINK 5X, and then one single S-Video cable, as the audio would also be traveling through those regardless of which of the input modules. I don't know that for sure, though. That's something that would be a question for Arthremis, or maybe it's something that could be controlled with some kind of configuration. I don't know, but that would be an interesting one. If not, you could just use Y cables to combine the audio. You're probably not going to get any buzz because you're coming from the same source from that, and that would be totally safe to do. I do have to ask, though, why do you need the TINK 5X? Because if you're running the RetroTink 4K, you could absolutely use HDMI splitters that have downscaling built in. So if you only have a 1080p capture card, you could be running 4K to your TV and 1080p to the capture card using that. HDR might be an issue, but I don't know if they do, I can't remember if those HDMI downscalers do HDR to SDR conversion. I don't remember. You would have to look that up. But if they do, and that's one of the issues, then that could just be a much easier way to do it. So then you could either repurpose your TINK 5X as a dedicated downscaling box or just sell it and, get some extra cash towards whatever else you want to spend on it. But I'll leave a link to the downscaling splitters that I have tested, and there's got to be more out there now. So maybe if you want to just try that out and see, that could potentially be a much easier setup for you. The only reason you wouldn't want to do that is if you have two different setups and you want two different things going on. But I don't think that's what you're looking to do. So let me know what you think, but I'll leave a link to the downscalers anyway. Next up, Dustin Mattson said, since I've got experience working with folks who are developing their own commercial products, what steps would I recommend interested newbies follow if they want to develop theirs for a possible release? They've got an idea about something that's not retro related, but they kind of want to know what they're getting themselves into. And the number one thing that I would recommend anybody who hasn't done this before remember is that building a prototype of something, regardless of what it is, building a prototype is incredibly hard. It requires a lot of skill. And, if you've gotten to that stage, awesome, props to you. But turning that into something that could be mass manufactured, distributed, and get gotten into the hands of customers is equally as hard in just completely different ways, which is so often why you have genius devs make products that no one can buy or the customer service is terrible. It's just equally as hard and often way more time consuming, but it's totally different. So depending on whatever product it is you're trying to make, are there existing manufacturing facilities out there that do something similar? And when I say similar, I don't mean the exact product you're making, but I mean surface mount components on a PCB, maybe some through-hole components too, with a case and then inputs and outputs and a solid testing mechanism to make sure they know that it's working if it's something complicated enough to require testing. Yeah, that's very easy. That's a lot of places out there do that, but you're always going to need to be doing your own quality control. You're always going to need to be managing the bill of materials, which that's another giant pain. If anybody remembers the videos I did for JLC PCB, that was by far the hardest thing for me personally, was just constantly staying on top of what's in stock, what's not, what's a valid replacement. Okay, now I have to test a couple off of this new batch because we swapped parts and we want to make sure they got that right. And all right, batch number 4 is exactly the same as batch 3. But is it? Let's pull a bunch out and look at it under a magnifying glass or microscope and run some tests on it and make sure. There's so much involved in that. And there's also lots of projects out there which you could hand wire a prototype and it works phenomenal, but it is almost impossible to have it mass manufactured. So how many are you planning on selling? Do you plan on selling a couple a month? Great, just hand make them yourself. But what happens if you get an order for 100? How are you going to handle that? Is that even possible? What would the price be? Would the price double if you had to hire people to make an assembly line to hand build a bunch of stuff? So those are all of the things that you really need to consider. And then of course it's distribution as well. Are you really willing to sit there and individually package every item and ship them to customers and then deal with lost packages, broken packages, people who aren't experienced and have a bunch of valid questions? And let's be honest, total freaking morons that are going to screw up whatever it is that you've made and blame you and demand their money back and do a bunch of bad reviews and post nasty things online. Like, you got to be prepared for everything that comes with that stuff. And that's the thing that most people just don't think about. And so many smart devs over the years have talked to me about stuff like this. And when I explain to them all that, they're like, yeah, it's fine. I got it. And then we've all seen what happens sometimes when they're not able to handle that properly. Products disappear, people lash out online. It's hard. It's really, really, really hard. And there's so much that goes into it. And then picking your price is the other thing that I always have to tell people. And some people, most of the time, they get it wrong in either direction. They either underprice or overprice. And overpricing sometimes works, but then that's just really going to motivate people to build their own version of it for cheaper. Underpricing is more common, and you lose so much money. And the stuff that people don't even think about, packing materials, lost shipments, taxes, all of that stuff really, really, really adds up. So you just got to take all of that stuff into account and see if it's really worth it for you. Worst comes to worst, if you really want to do anything, make a handful. Make some for you and your friends, hand make them, test them all yourself, and go from there. And if you're like, this was a fun project, but I'm done, it's a win. But if you're like, no, this is awesome. I love this. I don't like this part, so I'll just hire somebody to do this part, but I love all the rest of it. Like, that's great. And that's something you should definitely look into and try to pursue. But, understand that there's just so much more involved that no one would have expected until you start doing it. And that's really the stuff that's going to get you. So good luck with your idea. If you decide to do it, very cool. But just know it's going to be more than anybody would expect until you actually start. Well, that's it for this time. As always, if you have any questions at all, please just ask wherever it is that you support in the latest Q&A post, because the way the services work, it's kind of a pain to try to figure out what's a new question on an old post. Plus, as you saw today, I like to just scroll through the different services and answer questions laid back as if we were hanging out somewhere and just kind of have a conversation rather than, make it very technical and formal and stuff like that. I do like just kind of having laid back Q&A sessions like this one. But as always, thank you to everybody who supports in absolutely any way, especially the monthly services, because it's really you who's keeping all this stuff going. So thank you all very much, and I will see you next week.